Tonight, in the quiet walls of a grand English house, a death locked behind a door hides more than a simple tragedy, and Hercule Poirot must unravel a web spun from betrayal, secrets, and a long-forgotten vengeance. Before we start, I would love to know, where in the world are you tuning in from today? Tell me in the comments below. It's always a joy to see our Nightingale family gathered from every corner of the globe. Hercule Poirot and the Wire of Betrayal. Chapter 1. A Knock at Breakfast. The morning sun streamed cheerfully through the windows of the modest flat on Faraway Street, casting warm patterns across the breakfast table where Hercule Poirot and his faithful friend, Captain Hastings, sat. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the buttery scent of croissants, creating an atmosphere of simple contentment. Poirot, immaculate as ever in his dark suit and neatly waxed moustache, buttered his toast with fastidious care. Opposite him, Hastings, in his usual jovial spirits, pored over the morning paper, occasionally muttering under his breath at the headlines. "Ah, Hastings," Poirot murmured, reaching for the strawberry preserve with a delicate hand. "How agreeable it is! The simple pleasures of life. A well-laid table, a good friend, and no pressing matters to disturb one's digestion." Hastings chuckled. "Make the most of it, old chap. Knowing you, peace rarely lasts long." As if summoned by his words, a sharp knock interrupted their idyll. Before Hastings could rise, the door swung open to reveal the landlady, Mrs. Grange, a stout, no-nonsense woman whose apron bore traces of her morning's labors. She fixed Poirot with a firm, expectant gaze. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, arms akimbo, "I must remind you, your rent for this month has not yet been received." Poirot rose at once, bowing his head slightly, with a charm that over the years had disarmed many a firmer heart than Mrs. Grange's. "Madame, 1,000 apologies. A small oversight, I assure you. Next month I shall pay for 2 months together. Voila, all will be set right." Mrs. Grange, though unconvinced of the prudence of such an arrangement, could hardly fault Poirot's courtesy. With a nod and a slight sniff, she retreated, the door closing with a decisive click behind her. Poirot returned to the table with a twinkle in his eye. "Now, mon ami," he said, smoothing his napkin across his lap with satisfaction, "at last we may take our breakfast in peace." They had barely resumed when a second knock, sharp and insistent, sounded at the door. Hastings sighed and rose. "And there goes our peace." He disappeared into the hallway, and a moment later returned, carrying a single envelope in his hand. Poirot looked up inquiringly. "Who was it?" he asked, setting down his coffee cup. "A postman," said Hastings. "He left this letter." Poirot's eyes brightened. "Ah, that can only mean one thing, the case, perhaps." Without further ceremony, he slit open the envelope with a silver fruit knife, his motions precise and economical. As his eyes scanned the contents, his demeanor shifted subtly, growing more attentive. The letter was official, stamped with the insignia of the local police department. Its message was brief but urgent. The renowned jeweler, Mr. Edward Worthington, had been found dead at his residence under suspicious circumstances. It remained uncertain whether his death was the result of suicide or a more sinister hand. The police requested Poirot's immediate assistance. Setting the letter carefully aside, Poirot dabbed his mouth with his napkin, his breakfast quite forgotten. "It appears, Hastings," he said quietly, "that our morning is to take a rather more serious turn." "Trouble?" Hastings asked, folding his newspaper. Poirot nodded. "Grave trouble, mon ami. Mr. Edward Worthington, you recall him? The jeweler of considerable fame is dead. The circumstances are not clear." "I say," Hastings exclaimed, "you don't suspect foul play?" "That Poirot said, rising to his feet with sudden decision, is precisely what we must determine. He moved towards the small writing desk by the window and retrieved his traveling case, a modest but efficient affair. His movements were deliberate, betraying none of the haste that Hastings often displayed when excitement stirred him. "Would you be so good as to assist me in packing, Hastings?" Hastings hesitated, shifting uncomfortably. "I'm afraid I can't accompany you today, old fellow. It's my daughter's birthday, a family gathering and all that." "You understand?" Poirot paused, his eyes softening. "But of course, mon ami, family is important, most important. I shall manage alone." In truth, Poirot felt a slight pang. Hastings's company was always a comfort, but he had faced far worse without assistance. He busied himself assembling the essentials, a fresh pair of gloves, his silver-topped cane, a small notebook, and a selection of fine pencils, tools he deemed necessary in the pursuit of truth. "You'll be all right?" Hastings asked, a hint of guilt in his voice. Poirot smiled. "But naturally, I am, as you say, an old hand at these matters." Outside, the sounds of the city were beginning to stir, the clatter of hooves on cobblestones, the distant murmur of market traders setting up their stalls. Poirot placed the letter carefully in his breast pocket, adjusted his hat with precision, and made for the door. At the threshold, he paused and turned back briefly. "Enjoy the birthday, Hastings. Give my felicitations to the young lady." "I shall," Hastings promised, watching Poirot disappear down the narrow staircase with his usual, almost military briskness. Left alone, Hastings shook his head with a smile. "I don't envy whoever's responsible for this," he muttered to himself. "They won't have a prayer once Poirot gets started." Meanwhile, on the bustling streets below, Hercule Poirot hailed a cab with an upraised hand, stepping neatly into the vehicle. "Brentford Street, number 37, he instructed the driver, crisply. As the cab pulled away, Poirot leaned back against the worn leather seat, his fingertips pressed lightly together. His mind was already whirring, tracing the possibilities. Mr. Edward Worthington, a man of impeccable reputation, but recent financial troubles. A death in such a household was seldom straightforward. Suicide, perhaps. Yet Poirot's instincts, honed over countless investigations, prickled with a familiar unease. There were always little things, all with the things others missed, that spoke volumes to Poirot. And he intended to find them. As the cab rattled over the cobbled streets towards the quiet, affluent neighborhood where Edward Worthington had lived, Poirot closed his eyes briefly, letting his little grey cells do their silent, methodical work. Whatever awaited him at number 37 Brentford Street, Hercule Poirot would be ready. Chapter 2. The Locked Room. The black cab pulled up outside an elegant, if slightly weary, townhouse on Brentford Street. Hercule Poirot alighted, paying the driver with a crisp note, and gazed up at the grey stone facade. Heavy curtains were drawn across the windows, and a distinct air of melancholy clung to the building like mist. He ascended the steps briskly. A uniformed constable stationed at the door admitted him with a respectful nod, and within moments Poirot was ushered into the house. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy with sorrow and unease. Poirot's sharp eyes missed nothing: the whisper of servants in the hallway, the strained expression on the butler's face, the faint odor of gunpowder lingering in the air. Inspector Arthur awaited him on the first floor, standing just outside an oak-paneled door. He was a broad-shouldered man in his middle years with a practical manner and honest, straightforward eyes. He greeted Poirot warmly, extending a hand. "Welcome, Monsieur Poirot. I'm glad you could come so quickly." Poirot inclined his head. It is always the pleasure to assist, Inspector, especially when it concerns matters as serious as this. Arthur gestured towards the door. Come in. I should like you to have a look for yourself. Poirot entered the room. At the center of a richly furnished study, Mr. Edward Worthington's body lay sprawled on a Persian rug. A considerable pool of blood had formed beneath him, staining the elaborate weave. His right hand still clutched a revolver, and his lifeless eyes stared up at the ornate plaster ceiling. Poirot advanced slowly, his gaze moving methodically over every detail. The overturned chair near the desk, the scattered papers, the faint scorch mark on the sleeve of Edward's dressing gown. Nothing escaped his notice. Arthur joined him, speaking quietly. It's a sad business. Edward was a respected man. Poirot nodded absently, crouching down a little to examine the revolver without touching it. His nostrils flared delicately, detecting the acrid scent of burnt powder. Arthur cleared his throat. What do you think, Monsieur Poirot? Murder or suicide? Poirot, still observing the scene, replied with careful deliberation. At this moment, Inspector, I cannot say. One must not rush to conclusions without conducting a full investigation. Arthur gave a slight, understanding smile. Fair enough. Would you like to hear my view? Poirot straightened, smoothing an invisible crease from his sleeve. But of course. I value your opinion, Inspector. Arthur folded his arms. It seems to me a straightforward suicide. Mr. Edward had been under tremendous financial strain. From what we've gathered, he recently suffered devastating losses in his business. Friends report that he had become despondent. Poirot inclined his head, encouraging him to continue. Arthur gestured towards the heavy oak door. And there is the matter of the room itself. It was locked from the inside. There is only one door and no other means of entry or exit. The window is latched firmly, and the key was found in Mr. Edward's own pocket. Poirot's eyes glinted briefly. Ah, the key! An important detail. Indeed, Arthur agreed. The simplest explanation is that he locked himself in and, well, ended his own life. Poirot was silent for a moment, absorbing every word, weighing every nuance. Then, in his soft voice, he asked, Is there no duplicate key to the room? Arthur hesitated. There is a second key, yes. It's in the possession of Mr. Edward's wife, Florence. Very good, Poirot said. It is important to be thorough. And tell me, Inspector Woodthorpe, what exactly was recovered from the scene? Arthur consulted his notebook. Only 2 items of significance. First, the key found in Mr. Edward's pocket. Second, the revolver still clutched in his hand. Poirot stepped closer to the body once more, his gaze narrowing. He took careful note of the position of Edward's arm, the angle at which the revolver lay, the pattern of blood on the rug. These were the small things, the overlooked details, that often spoke volumes to Hercule Poirot. He moved around the room, observing the heavy velvet curtains, the glass cabinet displaying Edward's collection of antique watches, the fireplace cold and empty. Everything was neat, orderly, almost too orderly. To others it might have seemed an open and shut case. But to Hercule Poirot, the slightest misalignment, the tiniest irregularity, was enough to hint that the truth, the real truth, was still hidden in the shadows. Chapter 3. A Careful Eye. For a few moments the room was silent, broken only by the muted ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Then Hercule Poirot turned to Inspector Arthur, his expression grave. This, Poirot said firmly, is not a suicide. It is murder. Arthur's brows lifted in surprise, but he remained silent, waiting for Poirot to explain. Poirot stepped closer to the body once more, his hands neatly clasped behind his back. The bullet, he continued, struck Edward in the chest. Now, mon cher inspector, it is a curious thing. When a man takes his own life with a firearm, he very rarely chooses to shoot himself in the chest. The instinct, the natural inclination, is to fire at the head. Arthur frowned thoughtfully. I see what you mean, but in a moment of desperation, Poirot shook his head gently. There is more. The bullet was fired from a distance. Had Edward shot himself, there would be gunpowder residue upon his hands, a fine sprinkling, most distinctive. Yet I observed no such trace. His hands are quite clean. He bent over the corpse with meticulous care, his gaze lingering on the slender, lifeless fingers. No burns, no blackening of the skin, Poirot murmured, no powder marks. The revolver was not fired by this hand. Arthur shifted uneasily, glancing down at the body. It's a serious accusation, Poirot. Poirot straightened, smoothing his waistcoat with a flick of his fingertips. Not an accusation, Inspector. An observation. Always observe the little details. They are what lead to the truth. He stepped back, surveying the scene as a whole. The room itself was orderly, almost too much so. Nothing appeared to have been disturbed. Save for the overturned chair near the desk, a clumsy touch perhaps meant to suggest a sudden emotional outburst. Poirot turned to Arthur once more. Tell me, if you please, may I examine the key found in Mr. Edward's pocket? Arthur, though visibly unsettled, nodded. He retrieved a small evidence bag from his jacket and carefully handed it to Poirot. Poirot took the key delicately between his fingers, examining it with the air of a jeweler inspecting a rare gem. He turned it over thoughtfully, studying the minute scratches along the shaft, the worn edges of the teeth. Without a word, he slipped a magnifying lens from his pocket and bent over the body again, beginning a slow and painstaking inspection. He examined the folds of Edward's dressing gown, the positioning of the arms, the direction of the bloodstains. Most notably, he observed the placement of the body, lying directly opposite the door, as though Edward had been facing it when he was shot. Poirot tapped his chin thoughtfully. The body, it is too precisely positioned. Had a man in the depths of despair wished to end his life, he would have collapsed in a more natural, uncontrolled manner. Here, the arrangement. It suggests calculation. Arthur moved closer, lowering his voice instinctively. You think someone staged the scene? Poirot gave a small, satisfied nod. Just so, Inspector. This was a carefully planned murder. The criminal has been clever, very clever, but even the cleverest criminal leaves behind the smallest of clues. He held the key up once more, turning it in the light. And this key, it may yet tell us more. Its presence in the pocket is too convenient. Arthur exhaled heavily, running a hand through his hair. I must admit, Poirot, I hadn't thought to question it. A locked room, a man with troubles, a weapon in his hand. It seemed so clear. Poirot smiled gently, a twinkle of sympathy in his eye. It is easy to accept the obvious, my friend. But it is the task of the detective to see not what is, but what is hidden. There was a soft knock at the door. A young constable stepped inside, saluting smartly. Sir, the arrangements have been made. The body is ready to be transported for post-mortem. Arthur nodded briskly. Very good. See to it at once. The constable withdrew, and within minutes, 2 plain-clothed officers entered with a stretcher. Poirot stood silently, observing with respectful gravity as Edward Worthington's body was carefully lifted and carried from the room. When the last echo of footsteps had faded down the staircase, Poirot turned to Arthur once more. The post-mortem will reveal much, he said softly. But already we know enough to be certain. This was no act of despair. It was an act of deliberate malice, calculated, and executed with remarkable cunning. Arthur looked at Poirot, a troubled frown knitting his brow. "And the killer, Poirot?" Poirot smiled thinly. "The killer, Inspector, is here, somewhere close by. We must proceed with method, with order, and with caution, for whoever committed this crime, they possess both nerve and intelligence." He replaced the magnifying lens carefully into his pocket, his mind already racing ahead. The stage was set, the players were gathering, and the first move in a deadly game had been made. Chapter 4. A Widow's Account. Poirot remained for a moment longer in the dim, heavy stillness of the study, letting his thoughts settle into their usual precise order. Then, with a final glance at the now empty room, he turned to Inspector Arthur. "Tell me, Inspector," he said quietly, "who exactly resides in this house?" Arthur, still flipping through his notebook, answered without hesitation. "Mr. Edward lived here with his wife, Florence Worthington, their young son Harper, and their maid, Lily." Poirot inclined his head thoughtfully. "Merci. It is important always to know who is within the walls." With that, Poirot stepped into the hallway, where Florence Worthington stood near the foot of the staircase. She was a slight, elegant woman, her dark hair drawn neatly back, though the strain of the morning was evident in the pallor of her cheeks and the trembling of her hands. She clutched a lace handkerchief tightly, as if it were her only anchor. Poirot approached with the utmost delicacy, his voice soft. "Madame," he said gently, bowing slightly, "forgive me, but there are a few questions I must ask. I know this is a difficult time." Florence nodded numbly, dabbing at the corners of her red-rimmed eyes. "Firstly," Poirot said, his tone kind but firm, "may I ask, do you suspect anyone of having committed this crime?" Florence shook her head slowly. Her voice, when it came, was no more than a whisper. "No, Monsieur Poirot, I cannot think of anyone who would wish Edward harm. He was a good man." Poirot inclined his head sympathetically, though inwardly he remained cautious. Often grief clouded judgment, and sometimes it concealed inconvenient truths. "And may I inquire," Poirot continued, "where you were at the time your husband died?" Florence managed to steady her voice. "I was attending a party at my friend Dorothy's house in the neighboring village. She had just bought a new house, and there was a gathering of close friends to celebrate." Poirot gave a small, encouraging nod. "And what time did you leave this house, madame?" "Around 7 o'clock, Florence replied. "Edward had said he did not feel well and preferred to stay at home." Poirot made a brief note in his little leather-bound book, his pencil scratching softly across the page. "And you remained at the party for how long?" "I stayed quite late," Florence said, her eyes downcast. "It was after midnight when I returned." There was a brief pause as she struggled to compose herself. Poirot waited patiently, understanding that a heavy truth often emerged only when one allowed it space. "I learned of Edward's death only when I came back," she continued. "Lily, our maid, met me at the door. She said Edward had not answered when she knocked. She was worried, but she hadn't dared to disturb him earlier." Florence's hands twisted the handkerchief anxiously. "I used the spare key I carry," she said. "And when I opened the door—" She broke off, her breath catching painfully. Poirot's voice was low and steady. "Take your time, madame." Florence pressed the handkerchief to her mouth before continuing in a broken whisper. "I found him, lying there on the floor. There was so much blood, and the revolver was still in his hand." Her voice dissolved into sobs. Poirot, his face grave, made no move to interrupt. He simply stood by, allowing her the dignity of her grief. In his long experience, he knew that emotion, once spent, often left a clearer mind behind. When Florence had regained a measure of composure, Poirot asked one last question. "This spare key, madame, it has always been in your possession?" She nodded miserably. "Yes, Edward kept one key, I had the other." Poirot made another discreet note, his mind already sifting through the implications. "Thank you, madame," he said, with quiet sincerity. "You have been most helpful. I shall not trouble you further just now." Florence gave a trembling nod, then turned and made her way upstairs, her movements slow and uncertain. Poirot watched her go, his keen eyes thoughtful. Grief, yes, real enough. Yet there had been in her account a carefulness, a precision of detail dainted that he found curious. Grief-stricken women often spoke chaotically with confusion, but Florence's story had been very clean, very precise. It was not necessarily suspicious, Poirot reminded himself, but it was something, and Hercule Poirot never ignored something. Inspector Arthur reappeared in the hall, his face troubled. "Well, what do you think of her?" Poirot merely smiled faintly, tapping his closed notebook against his hand. "I think, mon cher, that madame tells the truth, or at least a version of it." Arthur frowned. "You mean she's lying?" Poirot lifted one elegant shoulder in a small shrug. "Not lying, perhaps, but telling only as much as she wishes to tell, and that, Inspector, is always of interest." He glanced around the house once more. "There are other interviews to conduct, n'est-ce pas? The maid, the young Sutton, all those who might have seen or heard something." Arthur nodded grimly. "I'll have them sent in." Poirot tucked his notebook away with a soft, decisive motion. "The smallest detail, Inspector. It is often the key to the whole mystery." And with that, Hercule Poirot prepared to peel back the next layer of the Worthington household secrets. Chapter 5. Quiet Suspicions. Having spoken to Florence, Hercule Poirot knew there were still other voices to hear in the house, other versions of the truth to be weighed and measured with the greatest care. He motioned to Inspector Arthur, who stood at a respectful distance. "I should like to speak with the son next," Poirot said. "Young Harper Worthington." Within a few minutes, Harper was brought before him. A boy of perhaps 17, with tousled hair, a casual slouch, and an expression that suggested he found the proceedings mildly irritating rather than tragic. Poirot, who was a master of reading the human face, noted this at once. He gestured for Harper to sit on a low chair opposite him. "You are comfortable, mon garçon?" "Good. Now tell me, where were you at the time your father died?" Harper shrugged with teenage indifference. "I was in my room," he said. "Listening to music?" Poirot tilted his head. "Music?" "Yeah," Harper confirmed. "It was pretty loud. I didn't hear anything, not until Lily came knocking and told me something was wrong." And then Harper leaned back in the chair, swinging one leg idly. "I went to Dad's room, tried to open the door, but it was locked. I couldn't get it open, no matter what I did." Poirot made a careful note in his little book, his pencil scratching faintly. He observed Harper keenly, the casual posture, the dispassionate voice, the absence of grief. When Harper lapsed into silence, Poirot fixed him with a penetrating gaze. "You seem very calm, mon ami," he said softly. "Your father has just died, in violent and tragic circumstances, and yet you do not seem troubled." Harper met Poirot's eyes without flinching. "No," he said bluntly, "I'm not upset." Poirot raised an eyebrow, inviting further explanation. Harper obliged, his mouth twisting slightly. "My father was always on my case, always shouting at me to turn the music down, to study harder, to grow up and be serious. He made air quotes mockingly. We didn't exactly get along. Poirot regarded him thoughtfully for a long moment. Still, he said at last, death has a way of softening the heart, does it not? Harper gave a careless shrug. Not mine. Poirot made another discreet note, then gave a small, courteous bow. Merci, young monsieur. That will be all. For now. Harper rose and sauntered away without a backward glance. Poirot closed his notebook carefully and turned to Inspector Arthur. You see, mon ami, he murmured, it is not always the tears that tell the truth. Sometimes it is the absence of tears that speaks more loudly. Arthur grunted, unconvinced. He's just a selfish young pup, nothing more. Poirot smiled thinly, but said nothing. There remained one more interview to conduct. He straightened his cuffs with meticulous care. Now, I should like to speak with the maid, Lily. Arthur gave the necessary orders, and presently Lily was ushered into the hallway. She was a slight girl, perhaps in her early 20s, with fair hair tucked neatly under a starched cap, and nervous hands that fidgeted with the edge of her apron. Poirot greeted her with a reassuring smile. Do not be afraid, mademoiselle, he said kindly. Just tell me what you saw, Ian heard. Lily nodded, swallowing hard. Now, Poirot continued, where were you when the murder occurred? I had gone to take Mr. Edward his tea, Lily said, her voice barely above a whisper. It was just after 7:30. You knocked on the door? Yes, sir. Several times I called out too, but there was no answer. And what did you do then? I went to find Master Harper, Lily explained. I told him that Mr. Edward wasn't answering. He came straight away and tried the door himself. Poirot leaned forward slightly, his eyes intent. And the door remained locked. Yes, sir, Lily confirmed. We both tried, but it wouldn't budge. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. And after that? Mrs. Worthington, Mrs. Florence, returned. She used her key to open the door. And then? Lily's voice trembled slightly. We saw Mr. Edward, lying there on the floor. The revolver was still in his hand. Poirot watched her closely as she spoke, noting the tremor in her voice, the genuine distress in her eyes. Unlike Harper, Lily's reaction seemed instinctively honest. He allowed a moment to pass before asking, Did you notice anything unusual, mademoiselle? Anything at all? Lily hesitated, glancing uncertainly at Inspector Arthur, as though seeking permission to speak freely. Poirot gave her a small, encouraging nod, but after a moment's struggle, Lily only shook her head. No, sir, nothing. Poirot accepted this without protest. He had long learned that some witnesses required time to remember, or courage to speak. He regarded her silently for a moment longer, then said, Merci, mademoiselle. You have been most helpful. Lily gave a small, jerky curtsy and hurried away, clearly eager to escape the weight of the conversation. Poirot turned to Inspector Arthur with a faint smile. And so, mon ami, he said, the picture becomes a little clearer, and yet also a little more clouded. Arthur frowned. How so? Poirot twirled the end of his moustache thoughtfully. Because each person tells a story that seems plausible, yet none of their accounts quite fits together as it should, Arthur grunted skeptically. Sounds like you're seeing problems where there are none. Poirot gave a soft chuckle. Ah, but that is precisely where murder often hides, in the smallest misalignments. He cast a glance back down the hallway, where Florence, Harper, and Lily each lingered in different corners of the house. 3 people, 3 stories, none quite overlapping as neatly as they ought. Poirot adjusted his hat with a brisk motion. It is time, Inspector, that we look not only at what has been said, but also at what has not been said." With that, Hercule Poirot stepped out into the pale afternoon light, the wheels of his brilliant mind turning ever faster. Chapter 6. Shadows of Doubt. The grey afternoon had deepened by the time Hercule Poirot and Inspector Arthur stepped outside the Worthington residence. A crisp breeze stirred the autumn leaves that danced across the quiet street. Poirot adjusted his hat and tucked his gloves into his pocket with his usual fastidiousness. They walked slowly along the pavement, deep in thought, until Inspector Arthur finally spoke. "Poirot," he said, glancing sideways at the little Belgian, "among the three of them, Florence, Harper, and Lily, who do you suspect? Whom do you think committed the murder?" Poirot's expression was unreadable. His small hands were folded neatly across his chest, and his grey-green eyes seemed distant, lost in thought. "At this stage, mon ami," he said thoughtfully, "it is not possible to say anything with certainty. All three are under suspicion. The circumstances, they are curious, but very soon the truth will reveal itself." Arthur looked unconvinced. "Still seems strange to me that a woman like Florence would commit such a brutal act." Poirot merely smiled, that secretive, knowing smile that Hastings, had he been present, would have recognized at once. "Appearances, Inspector," Poirot said gently, "are most deceptive. We must verify every word that has been spoken. It is not enough to accept what we are told, one must test it." Arthur nodded. "Where do we start?" "Our first step," Poirot said crisply, "is to verify Madame Florence's alibi. She claimed she was at a party at her friend Dorothy's house. Let us see whether that is indeed the truth, or a convenient story." Without wasting further time, they summoned a cab and set off towards the neighboring village where Dorothy resided. The journey was a short one, through winding country lanes bordered by hedgerows and gently rolling fields. The village was smaller than Brentford Street, a cosy cluster of cottages around a central green. Dorothy's house, newly built and standing slightly apart from the older cottages, was easy to find. Poirot and Arthur ascended the short gravel path and rang the bell. A few moments later, the door was opened by a cheerful-looking young woman with chestnut hair and quick, intelligent eyes. "Good afternoon," Arthur said, showing his badge. "I am Inspector Arthur, and this is Monsieur Hercule Poirot. We are here regarding your friend, Florence Worthington." Dorothy's smile faltered, and she stepped aside at once. "Of course. Officers, please come in." They were ushered into a comfortable sitting room where a fire crackled in the hearth, throwing a warm glow across the room. Poirot, after accepting a seat with his usual elaborate politeness, wasted no time. "Mademoiselle," he said, "we regret to inform you that Monsieur Edward Worthington has died under suspicious circumstances." Dorothy's hand flew to her mouth. "Good heavens! I had no idea! Poor Florence! How terrible for her!" Poirot inclined his head gravely. "Indeed, and we are making certain inquiries. Madame Florence has stated that she was here, at your house, attending a party, at the time of her husband's death. May I ask, was there in fact such a party yesterday evening?" Dorothy nodded immediately. "Yes, there was. A small gathering, nothing formal. I bought this house only last month, and I wanted to celebrate with a few close friends. Florence arrived just after 7, I think." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "And she stayed throughout?" Dorothy hesitated slightly. "Well, almost. She did leave for a little while." Arthur leaned forward. "She left?" "Yes," Dorothy confirmed. "She realized she'd forgotten her purse. She said she needed it and that she'd just pop back home to fetch it. She was gone perhaps 20-25 minutes, no longer. Then she returned and joined the party as if nothing were amiss." Poirot was silent for a moment, digesting this new piece of information. "And during that time, mademoiselle," he asked gently, "did you notice anything odd about her? Anything unusual in her behavior?" Dorothy shook her head. "No, nothing. She was a little flustered when she came back, but I thought nothing of it. After all, it was just a purse." Poirot smiled politely and rose to his feet. "You have been most helpful, mademoiselle. We thank you." Dorothy saw them to the door, still looking concerned. Once they were back outside, Arthur immediately turned to Poirot as they walked back towards the waiting cab. "Well, what do you make of that?" he asked. "It fits, doesn't it? She could have easily slipped away, gone home, killed her husband, and returned to the party without anyone being any the wiser." Poirot made a small humming sound deep in his throat. "It is possible, yes," he admitted. "The timing would allow it." Arthur looked at him keenly. "Then you think she did it?" Poirot held up one hand. "No, mon ami. You rush to conclusions. We must remember, it is easy to suspect the obvious, but the truth, it is sometimes less convenient." Arthur grunted. "Still, it puts Florence in a very awkward position." Poirot agreed silently. They rode back towards Brentford Street in thoughtful silence, each man lost in his own speculations. The countryside sped past the windows, a blur of grey fields and leafless trees. Poirot's mind, however, was razor-sharp and focused. Florence's alibi had a gap, a dangerous gap, and yet instinct told him that the matter was more complex than it appeared. At length, Poirot spoke, almost to himself. "Why leave the purse behind? It is a curious thing, is it not?" Arthur frowned. "You think it was deliberate?" Poirot gave his little shrug. "I think that we must look closely at every action. In cases of murder, even the smallest detail may be a calculated move." As they neared their destination, Poirot sat forward briskly. "There is more work to do, Inspector," he said. "We must continue to examine not only what is said, but what is not said." The cab pulled up outside Edward Worthington's house once more, and Poirot stepped down, his mind already plotting the next steps of his careful investigation. The game was afoot, and Hercule Poirot intended to win it. Chapter 7. A Fine Discovery. The afternoon was wearing on as Hercule Poirot and Inspector Arthur made their way towards Lily's modest cottage. The air was brisk, carrying with it the faint scent of wood smoke and damp earth. Poirot walked at a steady pace, his gloved hands neatly clasped behind his back, his mind busy with 1,000 small observations. As they turned the corner into a quieter lane, Poirot broke the silence. "We should investigate Lily's home," he said thoughtfully. "Perhaps we might find something of interest. The surroundings in which a person lives, they can tell us much, mon ami, sometimes more than the person himself." Arthur nodded in agreement. He had come to respect Poirot's meticulous attention to detail, even when it seemed to lead down the most unlikely paths. Poirot slowed his steps slightly and cast a glance at Arthur's neat police uniform. "You, Inspector," he said kindly, "should remain outside. A man in uniform, he brings caution, suspicion. Whereas I," he smiled modestly, "I'm but a friend come to call." Arthur gave a short laugh. "Very well, Poirot, I'll wait by the gate." As they approached the modest front door, Poirot adjusted his cuffs, smoothed his coat, and then rapped smartly on the wood. After a moment, the door creaked open to reveal a young girl, no older than 13 or 14. She had dark hair pulled back into a simple plait, and she regarded Poirot with a mixture of shyness and curiosity. Poirot offered her his warmest, most disarming smile. "Bonjour, mademoiselle. I am a friend of your mother's. Might I have a word with her?" The girl shook her head politely. Mamma's not home, sir. She's gone to work. Poirot made a sympathetic sound. Ah, of course. Then perhaps while I wait, could I trouble you for a glass of water? The day has been long, and one grows thirsty, n'est-ce pas? The girl, eager to be helpful, nodded and invited him inside. Poirot stepped into a small but tidy parlour, modestly furnished with well-worn chairs, a faded rug, and a small side table stacked with old magazines. Everything was clean, though a little threadbare. The signs of modest means honestly maintained. The girl motioned for him to sit while she disappeared towards what Poirot presumed was the kitchen. Left alone, Poirot allowed his keen eyes to roam unobtrusively around the room. His gaze settled almost immediately on a photograph hanging on the wall above the fireplace. It depicted two people, a man and a woman, standing side by side, smiling stiffly at the camera. The man wore a fisherman's jacket, and the woman a sturdy bonnet. They stood before a backdrop of what appeared to be a seaside village. Poirot rose and moved closer, studying the picture carefully. There was something old-fashioned about the frame and the pose, suggesting the photograph had been taken some years ago. Just then, the girl returned with a glass of water. Poirot accepted it graciously. "Merci, mademoiselle," he said. Then, with a casual nod towards the photograph, he asked, "And who is the lady in the picture?" The girl beamed. "That's my Nana, my grandmother. She lived by the sea before she passed away." Poirot smiled and murmured his condolences, taking a polite sip of the water. He seated himself again briefly, pretending to relax. Yet even as he did so, his sharp eyes caught a glint of something unusual at the edge of the carpet, near a low sideboard. When the girl returned to the kitchen, Poirot rose once more, moving with feline lightness. Bending down, he carefully picked up a thin strand that had caught on the rug's frayed edge. It was fishing wire, almost invisible to the naked eye, extraordinarily fine and strong. Poirot's eyes narrowed. A curious find in a maid's parlour far from the sea. He folded the strand carefully into a clean handkerchief and tucked it into his pocket. His mind was already racing ahead, connecting ideas, possibilities, methods. When the girl reappeared, Poirot offered her a final smile. "Merci, mademoiselle. You have been most kind. I shall not trouble you further." He made his way back to the door, stepping out into the crisp afternoon, where Inspector Arthur leaned casually against the gatepost. Arthur straightened at once. "Anything?" he asked quietly. Poirot gave a small, enigmatic smile. "But of course, mon ami, always something." Without offering more, Poirot set off briskly back towards the road, Arthur hurrying to keep pace. As they made their way back towards the Worthington house, Arthur pressed him further. "What did you find?" Poirot's fingers tapped lightly against his coat pocket. "A small thing," he said softly. "A thing so small, so delicate, that it is easily overlooked. Yet sometimes it is the smallest of clues that opens the largest of doors." Arthur frowned. "Fishing wire?" "Just so," Poirot agreed. "Fine, strong, almost invisible. In the wrong hands. A dangerous weapon indeed." Arthur gave a low whistle. "You think it's connected to the murder?" Poirot's face was serious now, the lightness gone from his manner. "I think, Inspector, that we are dealing with a crime of great ingenuity. A crime where every appearance has been carefully constructed to deceive." He paused, glancing up at the grey clouds gathering overhead. "And very soon," Poirot said quietly, "we shall reveal the truth, the whole, ugly truth." They pressed on, the village behind them and the final stages of their investigation looming ahead. Chapter 8. The Method of Murder. The heavy atmosphere within the Worthington household seemed almost to buckle under the weight of the gathering storm. The family and servants alike were called into the grand drawing room, their faces tight with worry, fear, and uncertainty. Poirot stood at the center of the room, poised and immaculate as ever, while Inspector Arthur lingered nearby, arms folded, watching the proceedings with a grim expression. The curtains were drawn, a dull grey light seeped through the edges of the windows, casting a muted gloom over the assembled company. Poirot cleared his throat gently, drawing every eye to him at once. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, firm, and carried the precise authority of a man who knew he was about to end the mystery once and for all. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, "I have gathered you all here because the truth must now come to light. I know who killed Mr. Edward Worthington, and how the crime was committed." A ripple of movement passed through the group. Florence Worthington clutched the back of a chair. Harper shifted uncomfortably. Lily stood stiff, pale as chalk. Poirot's voice remained steady. "First," he said, "allow me to explain how the murder was executed." He held up one finger. In this crime, 3 objects played critical roles. The first, the revolver, Mr. Edward's own, lawfully licensed. The second, the key found in his trouser pocket. The third, a thin, strong fishing wire, such as one would use with a fishing rod. The room had grown utterly still. Only the fire cracked softly in the grate. Poirot continued, each word deliberate, building the chain of reasoning link by link. "The murderer," he said, "first shot Mr. Edward directly in the heart. A precise, fatal shot, which caused him to collapse immediately and die where he fell." He paused briefly, his sharp gaze sweeping over the gathering. After ensuring death, the murderer wiped the revolver clean of fingerprints and placed it back into Edward's hand, thus creating the initial impression of suicide. Several heads nodded instinctively, though none dared to interrupt. "But," Poirot said, raising his voice slightly, "there was more. Much more." He stepped forward, indicating the floor. "The body was then dragged across the carpet. Not far, but enough. I observed traces. Bloodstains leading from the spot of death to the final position, along with faint marks of dragging." A murmur of astonishment ran through the room. Florence's face had gone white as chalk. Harper stared at Poirot in disbelief. Poirot pressed on, relentless. "The purpose of dragging the body," he said, "was to position Mr. Edward so that the door and the pocket of his trousers aligned perfectly. This was critical for what came next." Poirot now mimed the actions carefully with his hands. The murderer tied one end of the fishing wire to the spare key. The other end of the wire was threaded inside Mr. Edward's trouser pocket, through a small hole made near the seam at the bottom. He glanced meaningfully around the room. Then, the murderer exited the room, closed the door, and locked it from the outside using the spare key. Gasps rose, but Poirot held up his hand for silence. "After locking the door," he said, "the murderer gently tugged on the fishing wire, drawing the key underneath the gap at the bottom of the door, and guiding it until it settled neatly inside Edward's pocket." Poirot's voice dropped slightly. At the final moment, the murderer gave a sharp tug, snapping the wire, so that the key remained securely within Edward's pocket, while the murderer stood safely outside. The explanation sent a shudder through the listeners. Even Inspector Arthur looked momentarily stunned. A beat of silence passed. Then Arthur asked, frowning deeply, "But, Monsieur Poirot, how can you be so sure?" Poirot turned to him, his small frame brimming with quiet certainty. "Because," Poirot said softly, "the murderer is none other than Lily." An audible gasp swept through the room. All eyes swung towards the maid, who stood frozen, her hands clenched tightly together. Poirot continued, merciless yet calm. When I visited Lily's home, I discovered a leftover piece of the same fine fishing wire, hidden but overlooked. That alone would be suspicious, yes, but there is more. Lily, trembling now, spoke up desperately. Finding wire doesn't prove anything. Why would I kill Mr. Edward? Poirot's eyes gleamed. Patience, mademoiselle. The key found in Edward's pocket. Poirot gestured to Inspector Arthur, who brought it forward. Still bears a tiny fragment of the broken wire. It matches exactly the wire found at your house. Arthur held the key up for all to see. Though almost invisible to the naked eye, a sliver of the fine wire clung stubbornly to the metal. A stunned, almost disbelieving silence filled the room. Poirot pressed on. And as for your question, why would you do such a thing? The answer lies in a photograph hanging in your sitting room. He turned slightly as if addressing the entire house. In that photograph, there are two people, a man and a woman. When I inquired, your daughter informed me that the woman is her grandmother, and the man, Poirot's voice sharpened, is Mr. Edward. Lily gave a strangled gasp. Tears welled in her eyes. She swayed as though she might faint. Then, in a choked whisper, she spoke. Yes, it's true, I killed him. The words struck the room like a thunderclap. Lily staggered forward, her hands shaking violently. Edward was my father, she sobbed. When my mother told him she was expecting a child, he left her. He abandoned her because she wasn't carrying a son. He married another woman, left my mother in disgrace. Ruined. Her voice broke. Tears ran freely down her face. She never married again. She spent her life in shame and sorrow, crying for the man who had destroyed her life. I grew up seeing her pain every single day. I swore that one day I would make him pay. Lily collapsed into a chair, burying her face in her hands, overcome by the sheer weight of her confession. Inspector Arthur moved forward slowly and gestured for the constable to step forward. Poirot's voice, when he spoke, was very quiet, almost sorrowful. It is a terrible thing, he said, when hatred and revenge take root in the heart of a child. Terrible and tragic. The constable gently helped Lily to her feet. She did not resist. She seemed, at last, utterly spent, hollowed out by her own grief and rage. As they led her away, Poirot remained standing in the center of the room, silent. No one moved, no one spoke. Florence wept quietly into a handkerchief. Harper stared at the floor, expressionless. Inspector Arthur approached Poirot, his voice low. Another case solved, Monsieur Poirot. Poirot smiled faintly, though there was no triumph in it. Yes, he said. Another case. Another tragedy. He picked up his hat from the side table, smoothing it carefully with his gloved hand. As he and Arthur made their way towards the door, Poirot paused, glancing once over his shoulder at the grand old house where pride, shame, and vengeance had collided so fatally. He spoke almost to himself. The human heart, Inspector, harbors many secrets, and some, alas, destroy both the keeper and the kept. And with that, Hercule Poirot stepped out into the fading light, his small figure walking steadily into the twilight. Another secret had been uncovered, another burden laid bare, and somewhere perhaps the soul of a forgotten woman might finally rest in peace. Epilogue. The Worthington house, once a symbol of quiet prosperity, now stood subdued beneath a sky heavy with autumn clouds. Its grand stone walls, which had witnessed both triumph and tragedy, seemed to sag beneath an invisible weight. Inside, the staff moved in muted tones, restoring order to rooms that still whispered of past unrest. The drawing room had been cleared, the bloodstains scrubbed clean, the broken lives left to heal in private. At the far end of the lane, Hercule Poirot stood quietly beside Inspector Arthur, gazing back at the house. He tapped his cane lightly against his shoe, deep in thought. "It is always the same, mon ami," he said at last, his voice low. "There is murder, and there is motive. But underneath, there is always the oldest story. Pride, resentment, betrayal." Arthur said nothing. He had come to understand that Poirot spoke not out of vanity, but out of a deep weariness with the darkness he had once again uncovered. Poirot adjusted his cuffs, his movements as neat and precise as ever. "I take no pleasure in such victories," he murmured. "To solve a crime is one thing, but to mend the broken hearts it leaves behind. That even Hercule Poirot cannot achieve." The inspector gave a small, respectful nod. They stood a while longer, in companionable silence, the wind tugging gently at the hedges lining the road. Somewhere in the distance, a clock struck the hour, its chimes thin and mournful against the brooding sky. At last, Poirot turned away, his small figure walking steadily into the misty afternoon. He carried with him, as always, the burden of knowledge, the cost of having seen too much of human frailty. Behind him, the house receded into shadow, its secrets spent, its silence profound. And thus Hercule Poirot moved onward, one more mystery laid to rest, one more sorrow etched quietly into the pages of his remarkable life.